everybody! Welcome to the February video of the month. The theme for this video is being yourself. We live in a world that is constantly trying to make people into somebody that they're not, and we also live in a world where there's a lot of judgment, and so it can be very difficult to be yourself because you're constantly wondering, am I going to be good enough? Are other people going to accept me? Will they think I'm crazy or strange if I act like myself? But it is so important to overcome that doubting voice in your head and always be yourself. It takes a lot of courage to go against the norm and be who you really are, even if that's different than the majority of other people. But it's so important to always be yourself and just live in alignment with what you believe is right. Harry Potter had some very unusual characters who, throughout the series, were extremely different than the majority of other people around them, and some of them were judged pretty harshly. The tons of other people thought that they were weird or even in some cases insane, but they didn't let that stop them. They never let that change who they were, and that is something that all of us should aspire to do as well. In this video, I'm going to look at how 6 different characters from Harry Potter were great examples of always being themselves, no matter what others thought of them. And the obvious example from Harry Potter that comes to mind is Luna Lovegood.
Hello, Harry.
Luna, how do you know where I was?
Experts. Your head's full of them.
Luna Lovegood was thought to be odd by the majority of the students who went to Hogwarts with her. She was made fun of a lot. People actually called her Loony Lovegood instead of Luna Lovegood because that was her name. And she dressed strangely, for one thing. Like, for example, she wore radish earrings and specter specs, which, as Harry put it, gave her the look of a demented, multicolored owl. She had a hat that looked like a lion and roared like one too. So she was just already definitely a unique type of person, but the thing that made her really stand out from others was what she believed in. Her father ran a magazine called The Quibbler that wrote stories that were just quite frankly nonsense. Um, they wrote a story about how Sirius Black, a notorious mass murderer, who's also Harry's godfather, was in reality a singing sensation. It just had stories about things that were completely implausible, and it was sort of a laughing stock. Nobody believed in the Quibbler and the stories that it had, except for Luna. She always defended the Quibbler, she read it faithfully, and she believed these things that were kind of crazy. And that was one of the things that she was made fun of for a lot, but she stuck by her beliefs and did not listen to others when they told her she was crazy. Luna also believed in a variety of magical creatures that in the wizarding world did not actually exist, such as crumple-horned Snorkax and Nargles. Those are just a couple of the strange and imaginary creatures that she believed in. That was another thing that she was made fun of for a lot, and others were pretty rude to her at times. She was scorned often. People thought she was crazy. But Luna was a very unique person. And even though some of the things that she believed in may have been wrong, it was also wrong of other people to make fun of her for that. And she never let their nasty comments and scorn change who she was. She never stopped believing in her magical creatures or in the Quibbler stories, and she remained herself throughout the entire book series. The second character I'm going to talk about is Oliver Wood.
I spent the summer devising a whole new Quidditch program. We're going to train earlier, harder, and longer.
Oliver Wood was the captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team in Harry's first through third years at Hogwarts. And Oliver was a complete Quidditch fanatic. He called team practices in the most insane weather conditions when everybody was exhausted and tired. His teammates spent a lot of the time being pretty irritated with him for how ridiculous, honestly, he was being. But Oliver did not care. He was determined for his team to be the best Quidditch team that they could possibly be, and he worked them as hard as he could and whenever he could. And even though the team complained a lot and called him crazy and told him he was being fanatical, he didn't let that change him. He continued to be as obsessive about Quidditch as ever. The third character, who always was himself and was criticized a lot for it, is Albus Dumbledore.
Horace, do you mind if I take this? I do love knitting patterns.
And Dumbledore was a pretty eccentric man. Just to give an idea of this, a speech that he gave at Harry's first year in Hogwarts was Nitwit Blubber Oddment Tweak. He was pretty whimsical, and in fact, he was so odd that some people thought he was crazy. He had very unusual ideas about how a school should be run, and he did things that went against what many wizarding authorities believed were right, but he never let them stop him. In fact, when ministry officials would come and tell him to run his school a certain way, he pretty much just ignored them. He always ran things the way that he wanted to, and he always believed in what he thought was right. Dumbledore often stood up for the unusual in the Harry Potter series. He went against the norm. And an example of this is when Dobby, the house elf, came to him and asked for wages, he gave them to him. And there are not many in the wizarding world who would have done this. House elves were viewed as slaves, and it was unheard of to give them wages. But Dumbledore believed that if Dobby, the house elf, wanted wages and he was working, he was entitled to them. So he offered him wages and one day off a month. That was extremely unusual. And also, he stood up for Harry when Harry tried to tell the wizarding world that Voldemort had returned. Harry was thought to be crazy, he was a laughingstock, but Dumbledore supported Harry, and as a result of that, people called Dumbledore crazy as well. He never let others' criticism of his strange ways affect what he believed, and he was extremely wise, and so when he stood up for things, he was pretty much always right. And even when other people thought that he was wrong or that he was crazy, he never let that stop him. Another example of a character who always was himself in the Harry Potter books is Arthur Weasley.
Now, Harry, you must know all about muggles. Tell me, what exactly is the function of a rubber duck?
Arthur Weasley was the head of the Weasley family, which was a prominent and well-known wizarding family. And Mr. Weasley was very unusual because he was obsessed with muggles. That was downright dangerous in his time because when Voldemort was in power, being targeted as a muggle sympathizer was extremely dangerous, and that could lead to lots of bad things, like being murdered. And even on a lesser scale, people thought that he was a fool for being so obsessed with muggles. There were a number of wizarding families who were purebloods and who were very derogatory towards muggles and muggle born wizards, whom they called mudbloods. And those types of wizards called Mr. Weasley a fool for sympathizing with muggles and just being obsessed with them. He had a number of they called them muggle artifacts that seem like completely ordinary things to us, like cars and plugs and things like that. And he was obsessed with how they worked, with how muggles were able to manage so well without magic, and that was seen as foolish and weird and crazy. And he was certainly made fun of a lot by the pureblood families for this. And he never let that stop him. He continued to be obsessed with muggle technology. In fact, when he was bitten by a snake, he tried to get stitches to heal the wound, which stitches on a magical snake bite wound, that did not go so well. And his wife was pretty mad at him about that. But he didn't let others' scorn of his ideas change his obsession with muggles and how they lived. Another example of a character who was always herself is Hermione Granger.
How could I be so stupid? I checked this out weeks ago for a bit of light reading.
This is light.
Hermione was very, very studious, and to put it frankly, she was a complete know-it-all throughout the books. In fact, it says in the third book that all the members of her class had called her a know-it-all at least once in their life, and that her best friend Ron called her a know-it-all at least twice a week. So she got a lot of flack for how many questions she answered, how she was always so desirous to show off her knowledge, but she never let that change her. She continued to be extremely studious, even when other people told her that she was being crazy or ridiculous. If she got even one question wrong, she'd be extremely disappointed and angry with herself, and the other characters told her that that was ridiculous and she'd done extremely well. And she never let their criticism or their not understanding of how she felt change her. She continued to be extremely studious throughout the entire book series. The other example for how Hermione was always herself was with SPEW, a society that she created that was, the goal was to advocate for the rights of house elves. This was extremely unusual in the wizarding world. House elves were basically wizarding slaves, as I mentioned earlier, but the thing is, they liked it. House elves wanted to work for no pay, and in fact, if you offered them pay or if you offered them clothes, which was a symbol of their freedom, that was extremely insulting for them. And so people, including her best friends, told Hermione that it was crazy for her to have this society to help house elves because they didn't want to be helped. But Hermione didn't care. She thought that it was horrendous the way that house elves were being treated, and she was determined to do something about it. She did not let others' criticism keep her from standing up for what she believed in. The final example of a character who was always himself was Harry Potter.
Do you know there's a wizard in Nepal who's growing gravity-resistant trees?
Neville, no offense, but I really don't care about plants.
Now, Harry always said what was on his mind if he believed it to be correct, and this got him into a lot of trouble at certain times and made him pretty unpopular, but it didn't matter to him. The best example of this is when Voldemort returned. He got into serious trouble and became a huge laughingstock for continuing to claim that he had seen Voldemort return, but he never let that stop him. It upset him, of course, that others didn't believe him, but he refused to be silenced by others laughing at him or even by some people punishing him for saying that Voldemort had returned. If his views were ever challenged, he would always respond adamantly that he was telling the truth, that Voldemort was back, and even when other people didn't listen to him, he never let that stop him. He always continued to be who he was and say what he knew was right. Being yourself can be very difficult at times, but it's so important to stand up for what you believe in and always be who you are. There's a really famous Dr. Seuss quote that says, "Be who you are and say what you feel, because the people who mind don't matter and the people who matter don't mind." That quote is very true, and it's something that all of us should try to live by. That is all for today. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next month.